You might recognize this tune as The Entertainer. But let's be honest, most people know it as The Sting, the name of the film that launched it to worldwide fame and ice cream trucks all over the United States. But what you might not know is how this piece, written in 1902 along with the bulk of Scott Joplin's work, went from being virtually lost and forgotten to becoming the centerpiece of an Oscar-winning blockbuster.
The winner is The Sting.
It was mostly a happy accident. In the late 1960s, 50 years after Joplin died, one college professor's spark of curiosity lit the fuse that eventually wound its way to Scott Joplin, effectively scoring one of the most iconic soundtracks in American cinematic history,
From the Grave.
So stick around for the fascinating story of how a small group of visionary academics and musicians unearthed Scott Joplin's ragtime from dusty archives and private collections and brought it back into the spotlight. Without them, let's face it, the Sting would have had music written by somebody else, ice cream trucks would have a different tune, and millions of us might never have discovered an essential piece of our musical heritage. My name's David, and I'm a classically trained musician turned amateur who just can't quit music. The details of Scott Joplin's early life are hard to authenticate. Born sometime between 1867 and 1868, likely on a farm near the current town of Linden, Texas, Joplin grew up in a poor but musical family. His mother played the banjo, his father taught the boys violin, and young Scott practiced piano on an instrument in a home where his mother worked as a housekeeper after the family moved to Texarkana in the early 1880s. But beyond his immediate family, there were two characters in Scott Joplin's early life that influenced his path more than any others. The first was a man by the name of Julius Weiss, a German Jewish immigrant and jack of all trades, who arrived in the newly founded city of Texarkana around 1877. Weiss was valued for bringing his knowledge of European culture to a place that was largely devoid of any culture at all, and he quickly became a pillar of the Texarkana community. He took young Joplin under his wing, gave him free music lessons, introduced him to European classical music, and likely taught him to read music notation, a very rare skill, especially for African American children at the time. Weiss's early influence helped set Joplin apart and planted the seed of his lifelong ambition to elevate ragtime from lowbrow music into a respectable musical style. In the 1890s, Joplin moved to Sedalia, Missouri, drawn by its vibrant musical scene and opportunities to study at Lincoln High School and George R. Smith College, two of the more progressive all-black schools in the region. There, he met the second character, John Stillwell Stark, a music store owner who took a chance on publishing Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag in 1899. This wasn't Joplin's first published rag, but it was and would remain his greatest success, earning the moniker the King of Rags and propelling Joplin's own fame as the King of Ragtime. It was one of the best-selling sheet music hits of the era, with more than 500,000 copies sold in its first decade. Despite this, Joplin was never able to establish a sense of financial security during his lifetime. Stark's shoddy accounting, combined with fierce competition in the low-margin sheet music business, left Joplin chronically underpaid. Both men eventually moved to St. Louis around 1901, and this is where Joplin would write several of his rags and both of his operas. 6 years later, Joplin followed Stark to New York City, where he continued writing and pursued the production of his second opera, Treemonisha. His attempts were unsuccessful, however, and proved very costly, both financially and emotionally. To make matters worse, by 1911, his ability to play had begun to deteriorate, perhaps the earliest indication that he was nearing the final fatal stage of syphilis.
Dementia paralytica, which is the dread third stage of syphilis, in which the motor coordination is lost. And of course, in the case of Joplin, he completely lost his ability to play. He would fumble around and make mistakes, and it was a terrible thing to hear.
Knowing he was in a race against time, he continued to work, feverishly orchestrating Treemonisha, but also suffering from fits of paranoia, during which he destroyed many of his unpublished works, fearing that they would be stolen after his death. In February of 1917, paralyzed and insane, Scott Joplin was committed to the Manhattan State Hospital, and he died 2 months later on April 1st. He was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens. "50 years after his tragic death, a spark ignited. It began with William Bolcom, a young composer and music professor at Queens College. In 1967, a conversation with Norman Lloyd, head of the Rockefeller Foundation's music division, changed everything.
And we'd have lunch about this and that, and he would always sort of complain about the fact that he had to give money to orchestras who were not working for the younger people, not doing new music, doing the same old trieds and trues. He said, "Do you know Scott Joplin, the name?" I said, "I kind of heard that." He said, "Well, he wrote the Maple Leaf Rag, and he also wrote an opera in ragtime." And I said, "That sounds interesting enough. I think I'll try to follow it up."
Bolcom turned to a colleague, Rudy Blesch, who just happened to have Joplin's second opera, Treemonisha's piano vocal score. Bolcom was captivated from the first page. And then the composer's instinct took over, and he started writing his own rags. In his own words, he felt compelled to pick up a dropped thread of our emerging American tradition. Between 1967 and 1977, Bolcom wrote 22 rags, some of which are fiendishly difficult, by the way. But what I think is most remarkable about some of these works is that Bolcom, in his own rags, really taps into the essence that distinguishes Scott Joplin's music from most other ragtime and early jazz music. So what is that essence then? When we think about ragtime, there's energy, there's syncopation. It's dance music after all. But then there's Joplin. Thing is, the more you learn about him, the more his persona emerges. A very gentle person, sweet, and yet deeply sad. And that's the essence. That's the key ingredient. What gives Scott Joplin's music its depth is sorrow and struggle. Take Solace, for instance, which he wrote in 1909 after moving to New York. It's already one of his most beautiful pieces, but it becomes devastating when you consider just how ill he was when he wrote it. Bolcom channels this sentimental essence of Joplin in many of his rags. His Lost Lady rag, which is a lament for a failed marriage. And then especially in what is his most popular rag, the Graceful Ghost rag, written after the death of his father. Marc-André Hamelin, the brilliant concert pianist from Montreal, featured it in an NPR Tiny Desk concert in 2023 after recording a complete 2-disc series of Bolcom's rags released by Hyperion in 2022. Stunning writing, just gorgeous. Bolcom was obsessed, again his words, for over a decade and produced a body of work that was loyal to the spirit of ragtime, even as he'd crafted a fresh but accessible approach to the style. If you want to hear the authoritative recording of his work, you should check out Hamlin's album. But Bolcom wasn't to be the only one. Soon another musician would take Joplin's music to an even bigger stage, bringing it to the world's attention and the Billboard charts. Joshua Rifkin was a musicologist and pianist who'd made some waves in 1965 with an album of Beatles hits reframed in a Baroque style called The Baroque Beatles Book, released under the classical label Nonesuch. He'd heard Bolcom play some Joplin rags at a party once and asked him for some copies. He quickly grew enthusiastic, and since no recent recordings existed, he decided to record a selection of the rags himself.
I became really just tremendously taken up with Joplin. And of course, there I was at a record company, and I was making records for them. So I was able to come to them somewhere roughly the spring of 1970 and say, we really ought to record this music, and I can get the pianist for you cheap.
Rifkin's first album, released in 1970 under the no-frills title of Scott Joplin Piano Rags, sold 100,000 copies in its first year and went on to become Nonesuch's first million-selling record.
As we did with everything at Nonesuch in those days, we simply put it out on the market to die. Nonesuch did zero marketing, zero advertising. At most, they brought new records to people at radio stations. That was it. To our astonishment, literally to our astonishment, people really started getting excited by this music.
And by this time, the phenomenon that Bolcom had started, and Rifkin carried a big step further, had a name: the Ragtime Revival. The success of Rifkin's project also represented a posthumous validation for Scott Joplin. Since Nonesuch was a classical label and Rifkin's performances hewed close to the original scores, Joplin's dream of earning respect and recognition from the classical community came true at last.
I said, we ought to do it, and we ought to do it on a classical record label and present it in a certain way, and this was, I think, very different. This is not the way Joplin or Ragtime had been known and presented.
Thanks to Nikhil Hogan for allowing me to include segments of his interview with Joshua Rifkin on Scott Joplin. A link to the full episode is in the description below, and while you're there, check out his channel, The Nikhil Hogan Show. Okay, all you pianists out there, do you recognize this iconic book with the big green leaf on the cover? It was in my childhood piano bench for as long as I can remember, and I have a confession to make. Whenever I visit someone who happens to have a piano, I like to take a quick peek inside their piano bench. And I can't count how many times I've been delighted to discover that big green leaf staring back at me as I lift the lid. If you recognize it too, I'll bet you're just as clueless as I was until just a few weeks ago about its story. I'm ashamed to admit that until just recently, I never bothered to read the rich 30-page Joplin biography included in the preface, written by none other than Rudy Blesh, the guy who just happened to have the Treemonisha score in his sock when Bolcom asked for it. Nor did I read the editor's notes written by Vera Brodsky Lawrence, a concert pianist in New York City who quit her distinguished performing career in midlife to become a music historian. Fun fact, before I get into why she's important to this story, I had to pick my jaw up from off the floor when I discovered that Vera Brodsky Lawrence played the Western broadcast premiere of Shostakovich's Piano Sonata No. 2 at Carnegie Hall and held the exclusive performing rights for that piece for quite some time. Who knew? If you haven't seen my Shasta Kids video, check it out. Anyway, Bolcom was on a mission and approached Brodsky Lawrence, who he'd heard was editing a 5-volume collection of music from another 19th century American composer, Louis Moreau Gottschalk. True to form, Bolcom let the music speak for itself and just played her some Joplin rags. She was instantly hooked, and since her Gottschalk edition was nearly finished, she decided right then and there that Scott Joplin's collected works would be her next project. It was completely coincidental that just as Joshua Rifkin's first Joplin album was blowing up, Brodsky Lawrence completed the collected piano works, which was published by the New York Public Library in 1971. The recorded album plus the collected edition was an ideal symbiotic combo. They fed off of each other throughout most of the 1970s. Sales were goosed yet again in 1974 when The Sting hit the theaters, but effectively, a new market was created for this music that was new to most people, accessible to piano students and intermediate adult players, universally enjoyable for both listeners and players, and authentically American. And this is why the big green leaf is sprinkled across so many piano benches and sheet music libraries in homes all over the world. If you have it in your piano bench, leave me a comment. Gunther Schuller was quite the disruptor. When he became president of the New England Conservatory in Boston, the programs and curricula there, as at most other prestigious American music schools, were stuck in a musty, sclerotic rinse-repeat cycle of Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms. Schuller's mission was to reshape music education by advocating for programs that honored both classical and vernacular traditions.
It just pained me terribly. I just found it inexplicable that there was not one complete jazz department in any university or college or conservatory in the United States. The music born in this country around the turn of the previous century was not represented in the music curricula.
In 1969, he established the first ever accredited jazz program at the NEC, which inspired many other music schools to follow, including my own alma mater. He also added a program for early music performance and championed both contemporary and experimental music at the school. And so it was with this most open of minds that Gunther took a tip from Vera Brodsky Lawrence and decided to reorchestrate the tunes from The Red Back Book, a surviving collection of band arrangements of Joplin rags published by John Stark in 1912. The album of Schuller's orchestrations, performed by a newly formed ragtime ensemble at the New England Conservatory, was a hit. Titled The Red Back Book, to honor its origin, it was listed on the Billboard Top 100 for over a year, and it won a 1974 Grammy in the category of Best Chamber Music Performance, the most prestigious award yet to be added to Joplin's posthumous shelf. And here's where Hollywood comes into play. Director George Roy Hill fell in love with The Red Back Book and thought it would work perfectly for his upcoming crime caper and Newman Redford bromance, The Sting. On the surface, this was an odd choice, since Joplin's music predated the setting of the film in 1936 Chicago by more than 20 years. But he pressed on. Although Joplin's rags were written before our period, around the turn of the century, I kept connecting the marvelous humor and high spirits of his rags with the kind of spirit I wanted to get out of the film. When Hill reached out to Marvin Hamlisch to adapt the music, he was initially reluctant, preferring to compose original music rather than adapt someone else's. But after viewing the first cut of the film, he saw the vision and agreed. In the end, audiences were largely unaware of and therefore unbothered by the difference in era. And in 1974, The Sting swept the Oscars, including Best Picture. Marvin Hamlisch accepted the award for Best Original Sound Score.
I'm very happy, and I really wanted this. To a man I never met, but whose music was just wonderful to work with, to Scott Joplin. Thank you all.
It was only after The Sting's Oscar wins that in the spring of 1974, Scott Joplin's final resting place at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens was marked.
A maple tree couldn't be more appropriate for the grave of an American composer whose big hit was the Maple Leaf Rag. I guess the tree as long here as Scott Joplin has been lying here. That's since 1917.
And in 1976, he received a posthumous Pulitzer for his contributions to American music. It still stings a little, to see only Marvin Hamlisch's name under the tracks when searching for The Sting soundtrack. And most people still think The Entertainer is The Sting by Marvin Hamlisch. I don't know. In the end, I think Scott Joplin would still be pretty happy with his posthumous success and shrug off the Hollywood slight. He'd seen a lot worse. If you liked this video, please actually give me a thumbs up and subscribe with the little bell thingy, super important, and consider supporting the channel by becoming a member. This is new, and grab some merch while you're at it. You can do both on my Fourth Wall shop. Links in the description below. See you next time. Ciao.